Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar of the Asia Scotland Institute. I'm Roddy Gow, the founder and chairman, and I'm delighted to join you on this webinar, at which we will hear the views of Dr. Gerald Ross, whom I've known for many years and who is currently based in Montreal. Gerald was at one time the Dean of the Business School of McGill, and through his company, Rubicon Intelligence, has spent many years looking at the way in which companies are structured and will today address the issue of the failure of bureaucracy to manage coronavirus effectively, and he will highlight our inability to organize and coordinate our responses to such complex, dynamic challenges. He will explain how the coronavirus has become the new normal for many other challenges, and thus the need to transform traditional organizations. And considering this, he'll focus on the essential requirements for 21st century organizations and some key organizing principles. And he'll consider the implications for business schools and highlight the opportunities to create new paradigms to drive the next 50 plus years of organizational performance, including revised program design, a transferable, scalable pedagogical process, and a new organizational model. So it's with great pleasure that I now introduce a film which Gerald Ross has made, after which we will discuss the issues that he highlights. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Happy to have you. We're going to talk about the coronavirus and the lessons learned, but we're going to go beyond the medical issues, such as being prepared, or the economic issues, such as opening up the economy. We're going to talk about the organizational and management issues, because we seriously fumbled the ball here. So we're going to deal with three aspects of this. First of all, what went wrong? Why do we mess up? The second one is, if we had to rewind the tape, how would we actually manage this pandemic differently? What would be the process? Would we simply start 2 weeks earlier, or would there be more than that? Finally, what are the implications for business schools? After all, we're in the center of the field in management, and we should be the ones trying to figure this out first. I'm now going to talk a little bit about that first point, the chaos. There were clearly some obvious things that went wrong. There are far too many moving parts with hospitals, state governments, the World Health Organization. Secondly, there were advance warnings that weren't heeded, and we lost precious time. Finally, there was information overload, and we were completely overwhelmed, and the politicians didn't help. But there was a much more fundamental problem, and it had to do with management and organization. How do you coordinate such a mess? So we have a basic issue that in most of our large companies in government, we operate off the model from Henry Ford and Peter Drucker of the functional organization. We all know it well. And if you take out an organization chart, there's finance, marketing, accounting, and we all report to the people above us and below us, and the controls come down through the system, and that makes the system work, and then information comes back up. And most of the time, that's pretty good, as long as everybody reports to each other and there's a common mission. But think of a puppet. You have at the top the controls, and you move them, and the puppet dances. How does it do that? It's the string that goes down like the lines of command and moves the puppet around. So if you ask yourself, what was the common mission of the pandemic? Where's the organization chart? Who's the boss? Who's in charge? Let's have someone accountable. Let's have it transparent. What are the milestones? Do we have a strategy that can be sensitive globally? How do we do that? And the answer is we don't with our current system. So the functional organization actually is incapable of dealing with fast-moving, messy, uncertain situations. So we need to go back and take a fresh look at this because we seriously messed up. The issue here now is to stand back and take the lessons learned, because the pandemic is not the only global crisis we're going to have. We have global warming, we have mass migrations, we have cybersecurity, we have all kinds of issues where nobody reports to anybody and there are too many moving parts. So we run the risk of spending an awful lot of money and getting zero results. But also at the local level, how do we manage opioid abuse? How do we manage the homelessness? How do we manage affordable housing? Who's in charge? What's the system? How do we get it fixed? We do not have a bad management system. We have no management system. So as business schools, I think we got to fix this. Fortunately, we have some precedents to look to inform us going forward. I'll give a few examples. One is World War II, when the Allies came together and New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the US, UK got together to challenge Hitler. None of them could do it alone. Another crisis was the ozone layer, and we ran a risk of having serious damage to the planet. Here again, corporate and public entities came together, and the first thing they had to do is identify what was the source of the problem. And it was an ingredient in spray cans and other liquids that was destroying the ozone layer. So they had to devise a strategy and implement it. Ultimately, they got it done. NATO is another organization that's a consortium and has lasted for 50 years or more. So how are consortiums different from the classical bureaucracies? First of all, their structures emerged. So the day before World War II, there were no allies. The various members had different equipment, different budgets, different command structures, different everything. And they had to self-organize around a common objective. So they came together, and the first question is, what is that objective? Well, we've got to get Hitler. What do you mean, get Hitler? Do you want to assassinate him? No, you just get Goering coming up. Oh, okay, so what does it mean? So they defined the objective as basically destroying the German military machine. Okay. Then they each had different resources. The British had a great navy, the Americans could produce cheap tanks, etc. So each of the players had certain resources, but they weren't connected. So the leadership model is a council was formed with the major generals, Monty, Eisenhower, etc. And they formed a management team that didn't exist before the war. And their job was to make sure that they destroyed the German military machine. And the whole system had to work like a Swiss watch, because if you're landing on the Normandy beaches and being shot at, you don't want to be messing around. You've got to coordinate the Air Force from one country with the Navy from another and get this all working seamlessly in the middle of a battle. What are the key organizing principles for a consortium? They typically start when there's a crisis or a huge opportunity. The first principle is a powerful common purpose that unites people. Secondly, a motivated group of players who have skin in the game but can't solve the problem on their own. And the third is a council of leaders to develop the strategy and manage the implementation. What is the operational model? Typically, consortiums have a council at the top of the major leaders. So I mentioned Montgomery, Eisenhower, and they manage the whole process. And they operate in real time. Secondly, there are particular stakeholders that bring certain strengths. So in the pandemics, there were pharmaceutical companies working on a vaccination. There were people in their homes that were sewing masks. There were technology companies developing new kinds of respirators. So there are different resources, but in today's world, they're all unconnected. And finally, there are feedback loops in real time by hour, by day, by month, that gives data coming in to course correct. We witnessed that in spades in the coronavirus pandemic as information flooded in from all over the world. So what does this mean for business schools? We can look at this as the glass half full or the glass half empty. Personally, I think this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for business schools to build the new paradigm for management for the next 50+ years. What do we bring to the party? We have credibility, we do teach management, we have research, and we have delivery. So we have pretty much all the pieces. The question is, how do you get going? I'm going to put a couple of principles up front here in terms of how to deal with a business school to make the transition. The first principle is it's easier to get a 300 to 400% improvement in a system, in this case education, than a 10 to 15% improvement. Why? Because otherwise you're trying to bend an already inefficient system. We have to be able to deliver the highest quality education worldwide anytime customized to local circumstances. So we need to take a clean sheet of paper and say, let's get going with a fresh start. So what are the elements of a teaching and learning or pedagogical process? First of all, it has to be scalable, transferable, and adaptable to different cultures and situations. So is this a tall order? Well, I went back and looked at different pedagogical systems that scaled worldwide, and I went to 1499 when Ignatius Loyola of the Jesuits laid out 5 learning principles that could be applied to physics or English literature. The Jesuitical system survives today and thrives with 27 Jesuit universities in the United States alone, over 300 worldwide, and many more schools. Harvard University in 1952 invented the case method. It was a reaction to business education being too theoretical. And that drove a whole bunch of universities worldwide to be case schools. The third one is that the education process should be experientially based. What the case method did do is get students involved in decision making. But that was 1952. Today we can have gaming simulations and get people from hospitals to insurance companies to government to play a game called, let's say, Manage the Pandemic. There's actually a precedent for this in business schools, oddly enough. 50 or so years ago, most of your schools set up executive programs. And people at the time realized that you couldn't take an undergraduate or an MBA and bend it to suit a 1-day, 2-day, 1-week executive program. And so business schools set up, as you know, autonomous units that were connected to the other programs, could draw on some of the professors and research, but could bring people in from outside, had their own business model, had their own facilities and so on, and were basically semi-autonomous. So my suggestion would be that we build version 3.0 and say, okay, we need a semi-autonomous unit that is not constricted by curriculum committees and other constraints and can start afresh. The second thing I would say is let's not apply technology to an old process. The teaching process is over 500 years old, probably goes back to Greece. And it was a wonderful process. We all spent years listening to professors. We spent years being professors. But that process, however terrific, is not going to be the process to address these major global challenges. It doesn't scale, it's too expensive, and frankly, will not do the job. So we need to take a fresh look at that. We need a blockbuster business model that's completely unassailable. We can see in other parts of the economy where someone gets an unassailable model. I'll take Amazon versus Sears or Netflix versus Hollywood. They can change the world. So the business model for this is equally critical to work out. Finally, if we're going to preach about consortium and collaborating, perhaps we should practice it ourselves. So a question to ask ourselves is how can we collaborate to actually make these huge changes for the world and make it a better place? Thank you very much.
Gerald, thank you very much indeed for that clip. And I know that there will be questions from those who have been watching, but I've got a question just to start us off. The higher education sector is in something of a crisis because, of course, from a financial standpoint, the ability to continue and attract students is critically important. And so that presumably is a driver for embracing this change. How confident are you that the people who run these business schools have got what it takes to do that?
I think the first principle when you're developing a whole new process is to not have the antibodies from the old system come in and say, no, that's not the way we do it this way here. So if much like starting the executive program 50 years ago, we set up an autonomous unit. And so the curriculum committee for the undergraduate school could not come in and say, no, we don't teach marketing like that. They have to write an exam, etc. We firewalled off the executive program. And today, I think if you take any school, any organization, and you start saying, okay, we're going to do it the Harvard way or this or that, somebody will raise their hand and say, no, that's not what we do. So you need to firewall it and set it up as a new startup and to launch it with its own business model. Do not have it report into the old organization hierarchy. and basically start with a clean sheet of paper. So I think the biggest risk is actually we may be our own worst enemy.
Thanks. Okay, thank you. Doug, over to you to field the question.
Well, Barbara, do you want to lead off first?
Thank you. Not specifically related to business school model, but that we need a new model to deal with complex change. And the VUCA model, VUCA model of leadership and decision making that's been touted, I wondered if you've got some comment on that and whether you think it's a valid way to approach things.
I think the good news is there's a lot of experimentation going on in education, and people are experimenting with technology, with new pedagogical approaches, and that's all good. But it takes a while for a new way of doing things to emerge. We all may remember the Palm Pilot before we had iPhones. Mm. And you had to go through the Palm Pilot. You couldn't just say back in 1991, we need something in the palm of our hands, let's get it done. No, you had to have a lot of false starts. We went from the movie theater to blockbusters to Netflix. And so there are waypoints. So I think there's a lot of good innovation we can look to, but I would start with the business model. And the question I would ask is, could management education be a $10 billion business? And then I would work backwards and say, how would we deliver that? Now, I just want to use one example from my youth. My father said to me when I was a little boy, Gerald, the best car in the world is a Rolls Royce and Bentley because they're made by hand. There's no substitute for polishing the leather, stitching the leather, polishing the dash. And lo and behold, years later, he said, no production line can come close to a Rolls Royce. So if you're Oxford or if you're Edinburgh or one of the major universities, you might say, look, this is precious. These are the crown jewels. Lo and behold, decades later, Lexus comes along and produces a car with higher quality than the Rolls Royce or Bentley ever had, because Rolls Royce and Bentley couldn't produce anti-skid systems, engine management systems, all the things that we have, airbags. Now Bentley is owned by Volkswagen and Rolls Royce is owned by BMW. So you could imagine a scenario, I'm being a little facetious, where a university is owned by Google.
Gerald, thank you. I'm going to now ask Maurice Altman, I think from Dundee Business School, if you'd ask your question, please.
Sure, thank you. So, Maurice Altman, I'm the relatively new dean of the University of Dundee School of Business. Actually, I'm from Montreal. I did my PhD, my BA, my MA, and my PhD in the economics department at McGill University many, many, many decades ago. So my question to you is related to, in this area of this period of transformation, how important is it actually to maintain transparency and voice across all staff or faculty, especially if you don't have a faculty of 100 or 150, our business school is about 65. If we want to make a transition, our transition is actually to blended learning, so that we can take advantage of new technology and do synchronous seminars, workshops, et cetera, but you talked about cordoning off the transformation. Yeah. So what I'm asking about is not, instead of cordoning off, making sure you have that information and you have buy-in from faculty so they realize and they appreciate the benefits of moving forward. Thanks a lot.
Okay, I'll give a personal experience. It's not in the subject of coronavirus, but it's a personal experience of a new set of issues coming in that we couldn't handle as a faculty. So this was back when we had the crisis in governance, and we had Enron and Sarbanes-Oxley and so forth. And the Institute for Corporate Directors came to me and said, could you put on a program for directors? We desperately need much better quality directors. And I said, fine, I'll go ask the faculty. So I went and asked the faculty, and they said, I found nobody was researching governance. And they also said, don't do anything we don't do. And so I went back to the Institute and I said, I don't know what we can do. So in this case, to make an analogy to coronavirus and implications, if you were to design a management system for coronavirus, you would need to understand politics, economics, social behavior, God knows multiple topics which business schools don't even teach, much like we didn't teach governance at that time at McGill. So we had to respond. So I said, where's the knowledge? Well, it's in somebody who's been the head of an audit committee, a chairman of the board. And we made an executive program for board members. There were probably 2 of our faculty that taught in it, but we designed the process. We actually gave a designation, and but we don't have the expertise. So today, jumping forward, take global warming. Do we have a biologist on staff? So we're going to have to actually get beyond our own boundaries and reach out to other faculties and other universities. No one school can do this on its own.
Gerald, thank you. I'm going to now ask John Dulce if he would put his question to you.
Yeah,
sure. Thanks for that great presentation. It's so important. My question is that a big problem for dealing with global challenges is the denial of reality and science if it seems to threaten current power, wealth, or ideology. How do you deal with this huge problem?
If you take any group of actors, in this case, people addressing the issues you described, it'll form more or less a normal curve. And there's always a right-hand side pointy end of the curve for early adopters. So I've never believed in changing a whole system at all. You start to work with 2 or 3 universities who see this as a major opportunity, and you develop the first minimum viable product with those couple of schools. And then there are others who are followers who watch the leaders, and they say, oh, that's not rocket science, we could do it. So you want to selectively choose an area where there aren't the problems you're describing, where you already have some people that are motivated to do something and actually get something done. And you'd be surprised, we're all monkeys at heart, so people will imitate that.
Thank you very much.
Gerald, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to now pass to Wendy Wu.
I really like your point talking about resources are not connected somehow. And I wonder what role business school can play in terms of contribute to SDG goals.
Yeah, I think if someone said, let's start Monday, where would you start? And the first question is, what are the pieces of the puzzle? Who are the actors? There's some private sector parties, there's some governmental parties and so on, but who are stakeholders that have, that could be motivated? Going back to World War II, clearly Britain was motivated, the US was motivated, Canada was motivated, and you bring them together. And then you have to define the problem. So what would we do? So I think the business schools should be the hub of a much broader global learning system with a standard process that can be offered anywhere and customized in Asia, South America, North America. And so I think we put together the curriculum and we developed the teaching process. That's what we did with the directors. We pulled up, what do we have to know for governance? Well, something about audit committees, something about leadership, executive compensation. Who knows something about that? We brought them together. And then, so I think we become basically the inner circle coordinating the puzzle.
Gerald, thank you. I believe we have a question from Fiona.
I'm curious to know really why I am not actively involved in this world in a paid capacity with a medical degree, a lot of life experience in a range of relevant fields. Really, it's not particularly personal, but there are a lot of people of my generation, shall we say, who could be better used rather than waiting for another army of individuals going through tertiary education, PhDs, MScs, which seem to often be rather specific rather than general. This happens within medicine also.
Fiona, I'm passionate about this. Our education system, which used, when I started off at the taking a Bachelor of Commerce, yes, I took economics and accounting, but I took English history, I took psychology, I took some biology, and later when I wanted to go to do a master's in business, I was appalled that the business schools were organized in functional specialties, finance, marketing, accounting. So I took a master's of science in urban and regional planning because you cannot look at a city in a single dimension. And today with coronavirus, with global warming, you cannot look at a complex problem from a single set of dimensions. So I think our schools have, in all faculties, have become themselves part of the functional specialization. And we get people who are incredibly bright and talented, but they can't put together the puzzle. At least later in your career, I think we may not be able to find our car keys, but we have greater pattern recognition skills than someone who's 35. So I think that's an important factor.
I'll ask Lawrence Hodgins if he would ask his question.
Yes, I'd like to know what you think about blockchain. Has it died a death? Is it coming back? Is it something that we need to be aware of? And is it going to dominate business in the future?
I have to say I've always been skeptical of these things. One thing, when you've witnessed the various trends in business and other fields, there's always a new flavor of the month. You know, it goes way back to management by objectives. That was the hot new thing, if you can remember that. It was Six Sigma quality. Do you remember when we all read books on Japanese management?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think these are maybe informative waves. I don't put my trust in anything that comes in with too much hype. There may be some interesting fallout, but I have to say I'm not a believer.
So you don't give it any credibility?
Well, there may be some futures. It may be like the Palm Pilot. Mm-hmm. It may be an imperfect prototype, and later someone comes on. You know, in spreadsheets, we started off with Apple, the original Apple spreadsheet. I've forgotten what it was called. And then we had Lotus, and they came in like a freight train, and then all disappeared. So there may be a future offspring of this.
So it's not worthy of time and effort at the moment?
I think learning about new things is always worthy, just not getting sold on them.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you very much. That's super. Thanks.
I'm going to pass over now to Elizabeth Marshall. If you would ask your question, please.
I would like to ask what you think about the use of scenario forecasting, because one understands with COVID-19 that the possibility of a pandemic was in an original scenario, but this was somehow rejected, you know, for ordinary flu pandemic and not for viruses, when viruses such as those that come out of bats in the jungle and things can be far more dangerous. Do you think there's an opportunity to use scenarios and out of scenario forecasting, develop scenario management, you know, attach a management action to a forecast?
Absolutely. I think the whole process needs to be experiential, because simply learning things, listening to a lecture and writing an exam, you know, when students go through our traditional processes, and I appreciate many of you are doing innovative things that may be completely new and different, but I remember one of my associate deans managing an exam, and in the middle of the exam, the power went out. And so people were filing out, the emergency lights came on, and somebody said to him, when are you going to reschedule the exam? And he said, oh, don't worry, it's next week on Wednesday. And they said, well, we won't remember it by then. How often have we been guilty as charged? So I think we need to have experiential scenario planning, and particularly gaming simulations, on actually playing through. In the military, Roddy comes from the Army, he can tell us more about that. You don't just send an 18-year-old into the machine guns of the Germans. You scenario play with war games and things like that. So absolutely, the more interaction, the better. And technology allows us to reach out more broadly. So normally you have to be in the same room, but now you could manage from all over the world, manage a pandemic in a game.
I now have a question from Cube Alpha.
I wanted to ask a slightly wider question.
Yeah.
In terms, we've seen very variable responses from different Western governments, both in Europe and to some extent in the Americas. and I wondered what your views were on the loss of trust that I think will become apparent in a number of countries, and the manner in which this will affect governance at both micro and macro levels.
If we went back to roughly 1850, we saw the collapse of the monarchies. And after hundreds of years of monarchy, people finally said enough is enough, and one by one, we emerged into a more democratic and transparent framework, which we're at the end of today. So I think if you look at it today, we're going to have to feel a lot more pain. I hate to say that. You have to feel a certain amount of pain because bureaucracies don't willfully change. They don't. They're self-perpetuating, not because they're evil, but because they sustain themselves. And you actually have to break a few eggs. And we've broken a few. We may have broken enough. So I think the opportunity to come back to the theme of this is we've broken enough eggs in the area of pandemics. We haven't broken it yet for global warming, and we haven't broken it yet for mass migrations, but we have broken it to some extent with the coronavirus. So why don't we take this opportunity and say, look, we're not going to solve all the world's problems, Hugh. We're going to take this one, and can a couple of schools get together and say, let's not change the world, let's take Scotland, or let's take Peru, or let's take a country in Asia, and actually do the prototype, because there's no answer at the back of the book. But I think you have to break eggs before you get progress.
Right. What sort of, sorry, the scale of breaking eggs, what sort of scale are we talking about?
Well, I think we run a risk here. I think the eggs haven't yet broken on the pandemic. They'll be broken when we have to pay off the debt and the unwinding of the various debt and so on, and restructuring financially, which we will get through, but it's not going to be easy. And there's nothing like money for a wake-up call. And so I hate to say that too, but I think we should really study this opportunity, but not just limit it to health. Look at how this is a dry run for other complex, messy problems.
But is there a danger, sorry to hog the screen, but is there a danger that the loss of trust, particularly in countries which have manifestly populist leaders, is so great that potentially those democracies will be replaced by some other form of government, as happened in the 1920s and 30s, where there was a similar loss of trust as a result of very significant levels of unemployment, which may occur again in this instance?
Well, I hope I won't offend anybody, but if you take the United States, we have obviously Trump at the top, and he's a bully. And he intimidates people, including the whole Republican Party. And I don't blame him, because he is who he is. He's a demented bully. I actually criticize the Democrats because they have not stood up and done it. They've just complained. They just have outrage as their only strategy. So there's no vision, counter vision. And with Hitler, I imagine he intimidated all the other parties. Biden, who's a great guy, hasn't talked about the new America. What got Trump in is make America great again. What's the Democratic slogan? And I'm sure in England the same sort of thing. So we get terrified when there's a bully and we don't stand up. And the people on the other side, the job of the opposition, the nice thing about Trump is he's totally transparent. He's not, you can predict he's going to be outrageous day in, day out. Nixon was dark. You had no idea what was in Nixon's mind. So to compete against Nixon was very difficult. Trump's an open book. So it's like a sports team. When you see the other team playing one way, you literally watch videos of everything they do, and then you counter. And I haven't seen that from the Democrats. So shame on them.
Thank you.
Gerald, thank you for that. Perhaps next, a question from me. You are obviously forecasting the need for fundamental change, but I wonder whether there are any specific sectors we should be looking to learn from at this stage that are providing examples of best practice from your perspective.
I think there are, and they may be in multiple fields, not necessarily in this direct topic. I went through a personal experience with our firm. We had a company in Connecticut called Change Lab, and IBM brought us on when, you remember, they made the mainframes. They were the big blue, they dominated the world of computers. And changing IBM with 425,000 people, it was like the Vatican. You don't go in and change the Vatican. So, but the computers were getting smaller, cheaper, and everything, and they were not in a position to survive. So we had to figure out, how do you get 425,000 people to transition from a manufacturing company to a service provider looking more like Deloitte & Touche or Pricewaterhouse? And you have to redesign the plane while you're flying it. There are many other examples where companies have shifted entirely their focus. It may not be in the area of pandemics, and we should look at the change management models, the transformation models that we use, and see to what extent they apply here.
I think I've got a question from Louis Leciso.
I was wondering, are there any sectors of the economy or any companies that can serve as a model of efficient and effective response to situations like the COVID-19, which we've just gone through? And the second part of the question would be, what should the information flow look like over the next few months in terms of communication? And I'm talking internal communication within a company, not the news communication.
I'll start with the second question first. Whatever the new initiative is that you decide to do, it should be totally transparent and should be looked at as we're taking very innovative steps to develop, a new way of working. What you don't want to do is have it report into all the traditional bodies. You don't want to have the curriculum committee determining what this new initiative could do. But coming back to the first question, pretty much all my professional career, I believe there was a fundamental shift affecting all organizations of any size. The 19th or 20th century model of Henry Ford was about standardization, mass production, efficiencies, effectiveness, and so on, and we got an amazing benefit from that. When I was at the University of Michigan back many years ago, we saw the future as the market of one. When a market size is one student, one company, you say, well, how do we do that? That's impossible. Well, it is in that sense. But if you go back and take our educational offerings and you actually modularize them so they're customized can be customized to a hospital, a government agency, a bank, a manufacturing company. So an example, the first company that really broke the mold was Dell. I don't know if you remembered that. And in those days, let's say you're a researcher and I'm a banker. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we used 800 numbers in those days, you call in and order your computer. You might want a high-speed modem. I might want some other feature, a graphic. And our product shipped the next morning at 8 o'clock, and we got it directly. So no two Dell computers were the same. There was a market of one. You'd be one market, I'd be another market. So the only two things common between your computer and mine would be the box. It had to have the same box, and the motherboard, but everything else plugged into it. Much later, Amazon came along, and they didn't make a cent of profit for 10 years. And people said, this is never going to work. And Sears laughed at them because they were thinking of economic return on the store. But Amazon was thinking of the lifetime value of the customer. So you start off and you buy a book on fly fishing. And you say, oh, this is really interesting. I think I'll need a fly fishing rod. So you go back to Amazon, buy the fly fishing rod. Where are fly fishing streams in Scotland that I can go to? Where are hotels in Scotland? Now I'm renovating my house. So in Amazon, each of us is a market of one. And so if you're a millennial, raising your kids, redoing your house, or whatever it is, you're a market of one. And they looked at an actuary could take the lifetime value of a customer and calculate the economic value. So they, instead of saying, going back to the 20th century, we all believe in market share. If we have, the lion's share of market share, that's the holy grail. No, we want the lion's share of the lifetime value. So look at learning. Start as you go through from grade school, through university, through death, and say, what is your university share of that spend on learning? And most people say, well, I have no idea. We can't do that. So I think we're moving from a system that starts with the production and efficiencies and effectiveness, and starting at the other end with the customer, in this case, a student or company, and working backwards. So if you said we have a client, let's say it's BMW or Ford, how would your school optimize the lifetime value of that client for whatever it needs? And so philosophically, I don't think you can take the old systems, which are based on things like content delivery and accreditation, and bend them to fix that, because they're not designed to do it. I hope that wasn't too long. So I look at places, incidentally, Amazon doesn't own a bookstore. Borders went bankrupt. Nike doesn't own a factory. You buy a flat screen, it's all manufactured in Asia with your competitors all on the same production line by some other company. So I think we need to look at examples like that, and instead of saying, well, we have to own the factory and make money on it.
So that's where I think that this current environment is maybe pushing us to think differently, right?
It's fabulous.
That's where this is an opportunity.
If we bypass this one, we ought to put our heads in the sand.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ross.
A sobering thought. I have another question from Dr. Wendy Wu.
I think one of the questions is relating to empowerment and equality. I wonder what's your view about what role business school can play in terms of influence on populism, so kind of construct change through elite education.
The wonderful thing about business schools compared to, let's say, the biology department is we have access to organizations, not just individual students. So business schools clearly have executive programs, we have companies participating, and so we have an open door to the more progressive companies. And we need to actually help them figure out how to model that behavior. You're well aware, I'm sure, with startups, they have something called minimum viable product. And we want to start with an offering for some of our more forward-looking companies and say, look, no answer at the back of the book. We've got to figure this out. Let's start a program and grow it. We did a new pedagogical process at McGill when I was there. And it started with not how do you teach this material or these cases. It started out with what do you want the student to remember 6 months later and be able to apply. And in North America, we have the July 4th weekend. So we started after that with about a dozen professors from marketing, finance, HR. And they had no idea what we were going to do. And I said, well, we're going to develop a new pedagogical process and we're going to go to market after Labor Day. And they said, well, that's very short. And I said, no, it's so simple. You could figure it out by Monday morning. And they said, well, what are you going to do? So we had a half-day workshop, one a week for 4 weeks. And the first one was, tell me, you teach marketing, what should someone be able to remember from your course and be able to apply in 6 months? Well, you don't get 37 things, you don't get 12 things, you get 3 things, 2 things, 1 thing. So then I'd say, okay, so, and I would watch what you said and you'd watch what I said and we critique and we had it facilitated. Week 2, let's say take cash flow and accounting in business. How would you learn cash flow? How do you learn it? I have no idea. I mean, so what is cash flow? Well, cash comes from 3 sources: sales, investments, maybe from loans, and it goes out the door in 3 or 4 ways. You pay expenses, you pay off loans, you have dividends, and so on, taxes. So that's what cash flow is. So now you've got it. Now I want you to go to Alcoa or Citibank and improve the cash flow by 30%. And you say, well, what do I do? Well, you improve that ratio. Yes, but what do I do to improve it? Well, it's very easy. You either get more cash coming in or fewer expenses going out. There you are. You got it. Go for it. So we teach things, and you say, well, no, I have no idea. Where would I reduce costs? So we don't actually take people through to implementation. So if you had a gaming simulation called Manage the Cash Flow of Citibank, you could go through different things, you could stumble and so on. So we need to get people to action. And that's what the original case method meant over half a century ago. Let's try to get people to be able to solve some real problems.
Gerald, thank you very much indeed. And Gerald, I don't know if there's anything you want to say in conclusion before I sum up. and thank you.
I think each of us should stand back and say, who's prepared to roll up their sleeves?
Well, that's very short and sweet, but direct and to the point. Dr. Gerald Ross, thank you for joining us in this Asia Scotland Institute webinar this afternoon. We're very grateful to you for giving us your time and for answering all our questions. You've certainly given us some food for thought. Clearly, we need to learn from the lessons of COVID. And based on what you have shared with us, we need to think about a fundamental branch and root reform of how we structure our approach to tertiary education and management training. I think your last point about the whole life learning needs of the key product, our students, is all important. And this should obviously form the cornerstone of any future education or training development program. So on behalf of everybody on this webinar, I'd like to extend my thanks to you for your time today, and also to thank our audience for their contributions. Thank you.
This is wonderful.